Man returns home to a bloodied house and injured German Shepherd. The truth is unbelievable. John Anderson's life was a series of quiet routines. His house, a modest two-story on the outskirts of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, was nestled between dense forests that seemed to cradle it in silence. Most mornings began the same way, with the first light filtering through pine branches and the chill of dawn seeping in through slightly cracked windows. John would rise before the sun, slipping into worn running shoes while his German shepherd, Rex, danced in eager circles at the door. Together they would weave through shadowed paths, Rex's ears flicking at every rustle, while John's breast formed soft clouds in the crisp air. The forest trails were empty at that hour, save for the occasional deer or the haunting echo of wolves far off in the hills. John preferred it this way. Silence was something he had learned to cherish in the years since his parents passed, leaving him the house and all its memories. He had never been one for crowds or noise, finding solace instead in the predictability of his routines and the steadfast companionship of Rex. After their morning run, John would brew strong coffee in the kitchen, the rich aroma curling through the air as Rex settled at his feet, nose resting on massive paws. The walls of the kitchen were lined with shelves crammed with books, biographies, history texts, old paperbacks whose spines were cracked from years of use. John taught history at the local college, a job that suited him well. He was a patient teacher, though his students often described him as reserved, almost detached. In truth, John found it easier to discuss the past than to dwell on his own. Rex, at least, demanded nothing more than the occasional scratch behind the ears and a full bowl of food, which was more than enough for John. His only real human connection was Sarah Thompson, who lived in the White House just down the road. Sarah, a veterinarian with a soft spot for strays, would often stop by with a smile and a plate of something warm. Apple pie in autumn, oatmeal cookies in winter, blueberry muffins when summer finally chased the snow from the fields. She was bright where John was quiet, her laughter like sunlight in a house that too often felt cold. Rex adored her, bounding to the door at the first sign of her car rumbling up the gravel drive. John, on the other hand, never quite knew what to say when Sarah lingered a little too long at the door, her eyes warm and hopeful. Still, he found himself looking forward to her visits more than he would ever admit, even to himself. The woods surrounding John's house had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the sigh of wind in the pines and, at night, the eerie howling of wolves. The first time Rex heard them, he had growled low in his throat, hackles rising as he stared out the window into the pitch black. Now the howling was a familiar background noise, unsettling but distant. On those nights, John would sit in the living room grading essays, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the fireplace. Rex would press close, eyes alert, until sleep claimed him, leaving John alone with the silence and the restless shadows beyond the glass. It was on one of those nights that John first seriously considered the hiking trip. The idea had been nagging at him for months, a chance to escape the suffocating quiet of the house and clear his mind. He had planned it meticulously, studying maps of the mountain trails, packing and repacking gear. But one thing held him back, leaving Rex alone. Even with Sarah offering to watch him, the thought made John's chest tighten. He knew it was irrational. Rex would be safe, and Sarah had a way with animals that even John envied. But still, the idea of those amber eyes watching the door, waiting for him to come back, was almost enough to make him call the whole thing off. Eventually, it was Sarah's soft encouragement that persuaded him. "Go," she had said, her hand warm on his arm, eyes earnest. "Rex will be fine. You need this." And maybe he did. Maybe a week in the mountains with nothing but trees and sky would help clear the heaviness that had settled in his chest. So he agreed, though not without hesitation, and the night before he left, he knelt beside Rex, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "Be good," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended. Rex whined softly, licking John's cheek with a warm, reassuring swipe of his tongue. When the morning came, John loaded his backpack into the truck with hands that trembled just slightly, stealing glances back at the house until it disappeared behind a curtain of trees. Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand raised, Rex's dark eyes peering out beside her. The drive to the mountains was long, the road winding through forests that grew thicker and darker the higher he climbed. But as the sun rose, spilling gold over the peaks, John felt some of the tension slip from his shoulders. For the first few days, he allowed himself to forget. The trails were steep and demanding, leaving him breathless and aching in a way that was almost satisfying. At night, he would pitch his tent beneath pines that reached for the stars, the air so clear and cold it cut like glass. Sarah sent updates faithfully, photos of Rex sprawled across the couch, tongue lolling, stories of his attempts to chase squirrels and his sulking when bath time came. John read every message twice, lips curving into the closest thing to a smile he'd managed in weeks. Still, there was an unease that lingered, a gnawing feeling he couldn't quite name. It followed him on the trails, crept into his dreams, and tightened in his chest every time he woke alone beneath the vast, empty sky. By the fifth day, he could ignore it no longer. His hands were unsteady when he checked his phone that morning, breath fogging in the thin mountain air. When Sarah's message came, urgent, apologetic, explaining that she couldn't visit Rex that evening, John's pulse stumbled, cold rushing into the space between heartbeats. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that Rex would be fine for one night, but the restlessness only grew. By the time the sun dipped below the peaks, John was already packing, eyes fixed on the trail that led home. The drive back from the mountains was a blur of dark roads and the endless crunch of tires on gravel. John's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached, but he barely noticed. The radio was off, the only sound the hum of the engine and his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating narrow curves and shadowy trees that loomed on either side like silent sentinels. His mind was a storm of fractured thoughts, all circling back to the same image. Rex alone in the house, ears perked at every sound, eyes fixed on the door that never opened. He cursed himself for leaving, for ignoring the gnawing unease that had clawed at him since the moment he turned down the driveway. The darkness seemed to thicken as the miles crawled by, the trees pressing closer, branches scraping against the truck like accusing fingers. He pressed harder on the gas, the needle inching past the speed limit, but the road stretched endlessly ahead, and every second felt like an hour. The mountain air was icy even with the windows closed, and John's breath misted in the cab, shallow and fast. By the time he turned onto the final stretch of road leading home, the first threads of dawn were unraveling across the sky, pale and cold. But the sight that met him as the house came into view made the blood drain from his face. The front door was ajar, yawning dark and empty. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air gripped his spine. He braked hard, tires skidding on gravel, and threw the truck into park, his heart pounding so violently he could barely breathe. The silence was deafening as he stumbled out, boots crunching on frostbitten grass, breath coming in ragged gasps. The porch light, which he distinctly remembered leaving on, was shattered, glass glinting like ice shards across the steps. A book lay open-faced and torn, pages fluttering weakly in the breeze. And there, just inside the door, deep scratches scored the wood, long and frantic. John's chest constricted painfully. "Rex!" he called, voice cracking, but only silence replied, thick and suffocating. He moved through the doorway on numb legs, the house cold and dark around him. The living room was a war zone. Furniture overturned, curtains ripped from their rods, shattered picture frames scattering memories across the floor. Books lay in heaps, some pages stained dark and damp. His hands shook as he fumbled for the light switch, but the power seemed to be out, leaving only the dim, watery light filtering through cracked windows. The kitchen was worse. Cabinets hung open, contents spilled across countertops, shards of ceramic from his mother's favorite mug glittering amid splatters of something dark and sticky. The metallic tang of blood hung in the air, sharp and nauseating, and John's stomach lurched. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the tiles, breath shuddering in and out in shallow gasps. "Rex!" he tried again, voice breaking on the name. Silence. His heart was a wild, caged thing as he stumbled down the hallway, eyes darting over every shadow, every streak of dark red that smeared the walls. The door to the basement was half open, hanging at an odd angle on one hinge, and something deep in John's gut twisted painfully. He nearly fell in his scramble down the stairs, hands sliding on the railing, slick with something wet. His flashlight beam bobbed wildly, illuminating boxes overturned, tools strewn across the concrete floor, and finally, Rex, curled in the farthest corner, fur matted and darkened with blood, his normally alert ears drooping and eyes half closed. For a moment, John couldn't move, the relief so raw and overwhelming that his knees nearly gave out. Then he was kneeling, hands shaking as they ran over Rex's sides, checking for wounds. The dog whimpered softly, eyes flickering open, and his tail gave the faintest thump against the floor. "Hey, buddy," John choked out, voice hoarse. "It's okay. I'm here. You're okay." But his hands came away sticky with blood, and the tremors coursing through Rex's body told a different story. Anger flared beneath the panic, hot and furious, but John forced it down, focusing instead on the slow, unsteady rise and fall of Rex's chest. It took everything he had to lift the dog into his arms, cradling him as gently as he could manage. Rex's head lolled weakly against his shoulder, a soft whine escaping. But he didn't struggle, too exhausted even for that. John gritted his teeth, whispering soft assurances that were as much for himself as for Rex, stumbling back up the stairs and into the chaos of the living room. The sunlight was creeping higher now, spilling through broken windows in jagged patches, illuminating the wreckage with brutal clarity. John laid Rex carefully on the couch, grabbing a blanket to cover the shivering dog, hands moving on autopilot while his mind raced. His phone was in his pocket, battery flashing red, but it was enough. He dialed Sarah's number with fingers that trembled so violently it took 3 tries to press the right buttons. It rang once, twice, and then, "John?" Her voice was groggy with sleep, confused. He couldn't get the words out fast enough, voice cracking as he stumbled through an explanation that was more broken breaths than sentences. Sarah's tone shifted instantly, all business. "Stay there," she said sharply. "I'm on my way." The next half hour stretched endlessly. John knelt beside Rex, one hand buried in the dog's thick fur, the other pressed to his own chest to stop the ache that was building there, suffocating and unrelenting. He couldn't tear his eyes from the bloodstains, couldn't shake the image of the shattered door, the broken glass, the dark stains that trailed across the floor like some horrific breadcrumb trail. The sound of sirens was distant at first, then louder, a wail that rose and fell, fractured by the trees. Blue and red lights washed over the driveway, and then Sarah was there, out of her car and running up the steps, eyes wide and face pale. She didn't hesitate, dropping to her knees beside Rex, her hands gentle but efficient as she checked him over, her lips pressed into a thin line. John's voice was thin and reedy, cracking on every other word. He tried to protect the house," he stammered, throat raw. I shouldn't have left him alone." Sarah's eyes were fierce when they met his, a hand gripping his arm hard enough to bruise. "This is not your fault," she said firmly, each word a hammer blow. "Do you hear me, John? This is not your fault." He wanted to argue, to tell her that it was, that every bruise on Rex's body was a direct result of his own cowardice, but the words tangled and died in his throat, leaving him empty and shaking. The police moved through the house in a blur of navy uniforms and clipped voices, collecting evidence, photographing blood trails, talking in low tones that buzzed at the edges of John's consciousness. But he couldn't focus, couldn't think beyond the weak thump of Rex's tail, the dark eyes that met his with a trust that made his chest ache. He stayed there, knees pressed to broken glass, hand buried in Rex's fur, waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. The hours that followed were a blur of questions and flashing lights, voices overlapping until they blurred into a dull hum that pulsed behind John's eyes. The police moved through the house with methodical efficiency, snapping photographs of the overturned furniture, the shattered glass, the dark stains that painted a gruesome picture of what had unfolded in John's absence. One officer approached with a notepad, his expression grim but practiced. John struggled to answer the questions, his voice raw and hollow. eyes flicking constantly to the couch where Rex lay, his breathing shallow but steady beneath the blanket Sarah had draped over him. Every time Rex shifted, a fresh surge of guilt clawed at John's insides, turning his words to gravel. Sarah stayed close, her hand a steady weight on his arm, voice low and calming when his own faltered. Her presence was the only anchor in a world that seemed to be collapsing inward, a lifeline that John clung to with white-knuckled desperation. When the detective arrived, his eyes sharp and assessing, John went through the story again, each retelling scraping his throat raw. The detective nodded slowly, jotting notes, eyes scanning the room with a cold efficiency that made John feel exposed, like some insect pinned beneath glass. "Looks like the dog put up one hell of a fight," the man remarked, one eyebrow lifting, as his gaze settled on Rex. "Good boy," he added gruffly, and the words, simple as they were, made John's vision blur, throat tightening painfully. It was only when Sarah pressed a water bottle into his hands and murmured something about sitting down that John realized he was still standing in the middle of the wreckage, legs trembling with exhaustion and shock. He sank into the nearest chair, the cracked leather creaking under his weight, and buried his face in his hands, fingers digging into his scalp until the pain cut through the numbness. Sarah's hand found his again, warm and firm, and he leaned into the touch without thinking, eyes squeezed shut against the overwhelming surge of emotions that twisted in his chest. Guilt and rage and a grief so deep it left him hollow. He didn't flinch when her other hand smoothed gently over his back, her voice a soft murmur in the chaos, promising that it would be all right, that they would get through this, that Rex would be okay. John wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to that thread of hope. But every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the blood smeared across the walls. The shattered door, Rex's dark eyes glazed with pain. It took the better part of an hour for the police to finish their sweep, collecting samples, snapping pictures, murmuring quietly among themselves as they examined the claw marks that scored the floorboards and the deep gouges in the doorframe. The detective spoke with Sarah briefly, his eyes flicking to John with a mixture of pity and something harder. Something that said he'd seen this kind of thing too many times before to be shocked by it. When they finally left, the silence that fell was suffocating. The house felt like a hollow shell, walls echoing with memories that had been tainted by violence. John's hands trembled as he pushed to his feet, the room tilting alarmingly before Sarah's steadying hand brought him back, her eyes wide and worried. "You need to rest," she said firmly, voice brooking no argument. "Both of you." But John's eyes fixed on the door, splintered and hanging crooked, a reminder of just how easily his sanctuary had been shattered. "I can't stay here," he whispered, the words raw and broken, eyes burning with a shame he couldn't quite swallow. "Not after," his voice cracked, and he bit down hard, the taste of iron flooding his mouth. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Come home with me," she said, and when John opened his mouth to protest, she squeezed his arm, eyes soft but unyielding. "Just for a few days, until you're ready." There was no judgment in her tone, only a quiet understanding that unraveled something in John's chest, a tension he hadn't realized he was holding until it slipped free, leaving him breathless and unsteady. It took only minutes to gather the essentials: a change of clothes, Rex's favorite toy, a half-empty bag of dog food. And by the time Sarah pulled the car around, the sky had bled to gray, clouds heavy and dark with the promise of snow. John lifted Rex as carefully as he could, heart twisting painfully at the soft whimper the dog let out, his head lolling weakly against John's shoulder. The drive to Sarah's was short but seemed to stretch endlessly, the heater blasting but failing to chase the chill that had settled deep in John's bones. He stared out the window, eyes tracking the snow-laden pines that lined the road, each passing tree a shadow in the half-light. Sarah's hand rested lightly on the wheel, her eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror every few minutes to check on Rex. Her mouth pressed into a thin line of worry. When they pulled into the driveway, the windows of Sarah's house glowed warmly against the encroaching dark, wreaths of smoke curling from the chimney. It was the sort of scene that might have been comforting under different circumstances, but now it only made John's chest ache. a bitter reminder of the home that lay in ruins just a few miles away. Inside, the warmth was immediate and soothing, the fire crackling softly in the living room, casting flickering shadows across the hardwood. Sarah moved quickly, clearing a spot near the hearth and spreading out blankets, her voice soft and steady as she coaxed John to lay Rex down, fingers gentle but sure as she checked for injuries. The relief that sagged John's shoulders when she murmured that most of the blood was not Rex's was so sudden and overwhelming that his knees nearly buckled. He sank heavily into the armchair by the fire, hands braced against his temples, eyes fixed on Rex's slow, even breathing. The heat seeped into his skin, loosening muscles that ached with exhaustion and fear. But his mind refused to quiet, thoughts racing too fast to catch. Sarah returned with a mug of tea, pressing it into his hands and perching on the edge of the chair opposite, eyes never straying far from Rex. "He's going to be okay," she said softly, and for the first time in hours, John felt something like hope flutter weakly in his chest. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire's warmth wrapping around them, and for the first time since he'd walked through his ruined door, John felt the tension in his chest begin to ease, just slightly. His eyes slid closed, the exhaustion finally dragging him under, and the last thing he felt was the weight of Sarah's hand, warm and steady on his arm, grounding him in the dark. The first night at Sarah's house was a haze of exhaustion and restless dreams. John drifted in and out of sleep on the couch, the fire's warmth seeping into his bones but doing little to banish the chill that lingered beneath his skin. His dreams were fragmented and feverish, visions of dark hallways and shattered glass, of Rex's pained whimpers echoing in the shadows. He woke several times, heart pounding, eyes darting wildly until they fixed on the firelight, flickering softly across the walls. On Rex curled beside the hearth, chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Each time the sight eased the tightness in his chest just a fraction, enough to drag him back under. It wasn't until dawn's first light began to creep through the curtains, painting the room in pale gray, that John woke fully, throat raw and limbs heavy with fatigue. For a long moment, he lay still, listening to the crackle of the fire, the faint ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of blankets as Rex shifted in his sleep. The silence was unnervingly gentle, so at odds with the chaos of the night before, that it left him disoriented, breath-catching as his eyes roamed the unfamiliar walls. He pushed himself upright slowly, every muscle aching, and scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to chase away the lingering remnants of his nightmares. The room was cool despite the fire, shadows stretching long and thin across the floorboards, and John shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Rex's ears twitched at the movement, eyes cracking open, dark and bleary but alert. When they fixed on John, the dog's tail gave a faint thump against the rug, and the relief that coursed through John was almost dizzying. "Hey, buddy," he rasped, voice hoarse and unsteady, and reached out a trembling hand to smooth over Rex's head, fingers burrowing into thick fur. Rex huffed softly, eyes slipping half-closed again, but the tension in his posture eased slightly, muscles relaxing as if reassured by John's presence. The sight stung, guilt flaring hot and bitter beneath John's ribs, and he exhaled shakily, throat tight. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, fingers curling tighter in Rex's fur, and Rex responded with a low, rumbling noise that was almost a purr, leaning into the touch with a tired but trusting sigh. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, soft and hesitant on the wooden floor, and John glanced up to find Sarah hovering in the doorway, hair tousled and eyes shadowed with fatigue. She wore an old hoodie and flannel pants, a steaming mug cradled in her hands, and despite the dark circles smudging her eyes, she managed a small, tired smile. "You're up," she said quietly, voice warm and careful, as if afraid one wrong word might shatter him. John cleared his throat, wincing at the raw ache, and nodded stiffly. "Yeah," he managed, the word catching on a breath that quivered just slightly. I didn't mean to fall asleep on your couch." The apology was instinctual, automatic, but Sarah's expression softened, a flicker of something pained and understanding passing through her eyes. "You needed it," she said simply, stepping forward to press the mug into his hands. No one's expecting you to have it all together right now. The warmth of the mug seeped into John's palms, grounding and almost painfully comforting, and he swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the fire to avoid the kindness in Sarah's gaze. Thanks, he muttered, voice gruff and uneven, but Sarah only hummed softly, folding herself into the armchair opposite him, knees tucked to her chest and hands curled around her own mug. For a while they sat in silence, the only sounds the faint crackle of the fire and the slow, even breaths of Rex, the tension in John's shoulders gradually unwinding beneath the quiet. It was only when the tea was half gone and his hands had stopped trembling that Sarah spoke again, voice cautious but steady. "The police called this morning," she said gently, eyes fixed on her mug as she traced a finger over the rim. "They're still processing the evidence, but they think it was a gang. A few houses in the area were hit last month, isolated places, no security systems, easy targets." John's jaw clenched instinctively, fingers tightening around the mug until the ceramic bit into his palms, the warmth turning scalding. "They broke in knowing Rex was there," he ground out, the words low and tight with barely contained rage. "They hurt him." The bitterness in his voice was enough to make Sarah flinch, her eyes flicking up to his with a sympathy so raw and unguarded that it cut through the anger like a knife, leaving him breathless and aching. "I know," she whispered, and the sincerity in her voice was enough to make John's throat tighten painfully, eyes burning. "I know, John. I'm so sorry." The words shouldn't have helped, shouldn't have eased the tension knotting his chest, but somehow they did, just a little. Enough to allow him to draw a full breath, the ragged edges of his anger dulling beneath the weight of exhaustion. He sagged back against the couch, a hand dragging over his face, and exhaled shakily. "It's not your fault," Sarah said softly, the words gentle but firm, and when John's eyes flicked to hers, the conviction in her gaze was unyielding. "You did everything you could. Rex is alive because of you." John's laugh was short and bitter, a harsh sound that scraped at his throat. "He's alive in spite of me," he muttered, voice raw with self-loathing, but Sarah's eyes narrowed, something fierce and unbreakable sparking there. "That's not true," she snapped, the sudden sharpness startling him into silence. "You came back. You saved him. That matters, John." Her voice softened at the edges, anger giving way to something raw and aching. "You're here now. That's what matters." The words lodged like glass beneath John's sternum, cutting and jagged, but he couldn't find the strength to argue. The fight drained from his limbs, leaving only bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He slumped forward, elbows braced on his knees, hands tangled in his hair, breath shuddering with every exhale. Sarah was quiet for a moment, the silence stretching heavy and fragile between them, before her hand found his back, palm warm and steady, a touch that was gentle but grounding, holding him together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. John's eyes slipped shut, throat tight and aching, and for a long time he stayed like that, hunched and shaking and silent, Sarah's hand never leaving his back. The days blurred together, a slow and exhausting rhythm of recovery and repair. John stayed at Sarah's longer than he'd planned, too drained to face the wreckage of his own home, and Sarah never once complained, her quiet presence a balm for the raw edges of his nerves. Rex recovered slowly but steadily, strength returning with each passing day until he could follow John around the house, his tail wagging weakly but insistently. The police kept in touch, their updates a mix of hollow reassurances and grim truths that left John cold and restless. The gang had been part of a string of robberies targeting isolated homes, violent and efficient, and John's house had just been the latest in a long list. The men were still at large, identities unknown, and the detectives' clipped words, "We'll let you know as soon as we have anything," echoed bitterly in John's ears long after the call ended. Each update made the knot in his chest tighten, guilt and helplessness twisting tighter, until his hands shook and his jaw ached from gritting his teeth. He spent hours staring at the fire or pacing the length of Sarah's living room, fingers curling and uncurling restlessly. Sarah tried to coax him into eating, into resting, her voice warm and soothing as she pressed plates of food into his hands and guided him gently back to the couch when he swayed with exhaustion. John ate mechanically, tasting nothing, eyes fixed on the window and the forest beyond, dark and ominous even in the daylight. Every gust of wind set his nerves on edge. Every rustle in the trees had him tensing, muscles coiled tight with the instinct to run, to fight, to do something other than sit here, useless and helpless and hollow. It was Rex who finally broke the cycle. One evening when the shadows had stretched long and the house was quiet save for the crackle of the fire. The German shepherd nudged at John's hand insistently, dark eyes sharp and knowing, and when John glanced down, Rex let out a huff, tail thumping the floor with something like exasperation. The sight tugged a weak, hoarse laugh from John's throat, and the sound was so foreign, so startling in the silence, that he had to press a hand to his mouth, breath hitching painfully. The next morning when John hesitantly mentioned wanting to go back to the house, to see the damage, to try and reclaim what was left, Sarah didn't hesitate. "Of course," she said gently, her eyes soft and steady, and she squeezed his hand once, quick and reassuring. "Whenever you're ready." It took another 2 days to gather the courage, but when they finally pulled into the driveway, John's chest tightened with a mix of dread and determination that left him breathless. The house loomed dark and hollow, windows gaping like eyes, the door still splintered and hanging crooked, despite the police tape that crisscrossed the porch. For a long moment, John just sat in the car, hands clenched, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, breath coming shallow and fast. Sarah's hand covered his, warm and grounding, and John sucked in a shaky breath, forcing the tension from his shoulders as best he could. "I can't," he choked out, voice cracking, but Sarah's hand tightened, her voice low and firm. "Yes, you can," she said softly, her eyes dark and unyielding. "You don't have to do it alone." With Sarah's hand in his and Rex pressed solid and warm against his leg, John forced himself out of the car, boots crunching on gravel. The door creaked ominously when he pushed it open, the hallway beyond dark and stifling. The air was stale, heavy with dust and something else, coppery and bitter and too close to blood. John's stomach lurched, bile rising hot and acrid in his throat. But Sarah's hand was steady in his, her presence a lifeline, and he swallowed hard, throat working convulsively. They moved slowly, cautiously, picking their way through the mess with careful steps. The living room was unrecognizable, books and shattered glass littering the floor, furniture overturned and slashed, picture frames cracked and bleeding photographs. The walls were streaked dark with blood, some of it Rex's, some of it the intruder's, and the sight sent a fresh surge of nausea roiling through John's gut. He leaned heavily against the wall, breath coming fast and shallow, fingers trembling against the wallpaper, and Sarah's hand was there instantly, her voice low and soothing, words a steady stream of reassurance that washed over him, grounding him. "It's just a house," she murmured, her thumb tracing small circles over his knuckles, voice soft but unshakable. "It's just walls and windows. You're okay. Rex is okay. You're safe now." The words shouldn't have helped, but somehow they did. Something in John's chest loosening, breath evening out as he clung to the warmth of her hand and the quiet conviction in her eyes. When he finally pulled back, unsteady but upright, Sarah squeezed his hand one last time before stepping back, giving him space but staying close, a silent promise in the way her eyes never left him. They spent the rest of the day cleaning, scrubbing bloodstains from walls and floors, picking glass from the carpet, setting books back on shelves and righting furniture with aching arms and raw hands. It was grueling, exhausting work, but it was something. And by the time the sun began to dip low on the horizon, staining the sky golden red, the house was starting to look like a home again. John sank into the worn armchair by the fire, limbs trembling with fatigue, but heart beating steadier than it had in days, eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Rex curled at his feet with a soft sigh, eyes half-lidded in content, and Sarah lowered herself onto the couch, leaning back with a tired but warm smile. For a long time, none of them spoke, the silence stretching warm and soft, the fire's glow painting the walls in hues of amber and bronze. John let his eyes slip closed, exhaustion weighing heavy on his limbs. And when Sarah's hand found his, fingers tangling gently, he didn't pull away, didn't even flinch, just exhaled, slow and even, tension bleeding from his shoulders. "Thank you," he murmured hoarsely, the words barely more than a breath, but Sarah's smile softened, eyes warm and understanding. "Anytime," she whispered, thumb brushing gently over his knuckles, and John's chest ached with something bittersweet and fragile, something that felt like hope. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sweeping snow in soft drifts across the porch. But inside, the fire crackled warmly, shadows dancing on the walls, and John let himself sink into the warmth, into the soft press of Sarah's hand in his, and the steady rise and fall of Rex's breaths, eyelids heavy with sleep. For the first time in days, the silence wasn't suffocating, wasn't dark and hollow and full of ghosts. It was warm and quiet and safe, a promise of something new, something whole. And for now, that was enough.